When an anxious boy arrives at Oakridge Middle School with bruises on his arms and a haunted look in his eyes, what seemed at first like simple clumsiness takes a sinister turn as troubling facts emerge, revealing a dark truth that endangers not only his life but the safety of those who step forward to help him. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Jacob was 11 years old when he first set foot in Oakridge Middle School. He walked into the front office with timid, shuffling steps, holding a worn backpack against his chest. The secretary at the reception desk, Ms. Alvarez, gave him a warm smile, though her greeting only made his eyes dart around nervously as if he feared someone was watching. She found his name on the roster, handed him a schedule, and tried to show him which hallway led to his homeroom. But Jacob barely looked up. He mumbled something inaudible, nodding quickly, then slipped away without saying another word. In the following days, teachers began to notice him, a small boy with pale skin and deep shadows under his eyes, wearing long sleeves even in the mild autumn weather. He rarely spoke unless prompted, and when he did, it came in half-formed sentences or quiet mumbles that left the listener leaning in. If a classmate brushed against him by accident in the crowded hallway, he flinched like a startled animal. Bruises sometimes showed on his wrists when his sleeves slipped, greenish or yellowing marks that he explained away with stammers about roughhousing or falls. He never quite met anyone's gaze, as though eye contact itself was a threat. Two teachers took particular interest in him. The first was Mr. Bennett, a language arts teacher known for his gentle approach and encouragement of creativity. He noticed how Jacob sat hunched at a desk in the back row, scribbling small sketches in the margins of his notebook rather than focusing on the lessons. One day, Mr. Bennett quietly leaned over and said, "I like your drawings, Jacob. Do you draw at home too?" Jacob froze. He shrugged but refused to say more, eyes lowered. Still, Mr. Bennett caught a glimpse of a sorrow in him that ran deeper than mere shyness. The second concerned teacher was Ms. Hayes, who taught math. She noticed the boy's aptitude for numbers whenever he did homework, but also how his hands trembled whenever she asked him to solve a problem at the board. Sometimes, if he caught a glimpse of a figure in the hallway, maybe a taller adult or someone with a stern expression, Jacob would tense up, stumbling over his words. Ms. Hayes mentioned these observations to Mr. Bennett over lunch one day. "There's something off," she said, voice hushed in the teacher's lounge. "He acts like he's waiting for something bad to happen." Mr. Bennett nodded, sharing his own concerns about the bruises and the boy's flighty demeanor. They agreed to keep an eye on him. But the staff member who truly spurred them to action was Mr. Sullivan, the school's janitor. Known for being friendly to kids who lingered after class, he often bumped into Jacob in the halls. One afternoon, well past the final bell, Mr. Sullivan found the boy hidden behind the vending machines, hugging his knees. "Hey there," Mr. Sullivan said gently, bending down. "What are you still doing on campus?" Jacob stared at him, tears trembling in his eyes. I can't go home," he whispered. "Please let me stay." His tone was so desperate that Mr. Sullivan's heart lurched. He convinced Jacob to follow him to the front office, but the boy grew frantic when the janitor suggested calling whoever was supposed to pick him up. No, please don't call them," Jacob pleaded. "They'll be mad." Mr. Sullivan placed a careful hand on his shoulder, reassuring him softly. "It's all right, I'll just check with your teacher." But Jacob shook his head again, terror plain on his face. Sensing something serious, Mr. Sullivan sat with him in a quiet corner near the administration offices, urging him to confide. Jacob only repeated that he was too scared to go home, that he dreaded what would happen if they found out he'd told anyone. The janitor took a deep breath. He never had formal training in these matters, but even he recognized signs of abuse. He asked if someone was hurting him, but Jacob averted his gaze, lips pressed together. Eventually, the boy nodded, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. "I can't tell," he mumbled. "They'll hurt me worse." Shaken, Mr. Sullivan alerted Mr. Bennett and Ms. Hayes. Together they sat with Jacob for over an hour, trying gently to coax him into revealing more. They discovered he was in foster care with a family named the Mitchells, Danielle and Karen Mitchell. He refused to speak ill of them, but his trembling posture and repeated pleas to remain at school painted a grim picture. Ms. Hayes said softly, "We want to help Jacob. We can talk to someone who can keep you safe." He only shook his head, silent tears rolling. A wave of helplessness gripped them all. By nightfall, Ms. Hayes had no choice but to call the principal, who then called the local social worker. Jacob collapsed into sobs when he realized Child Protective Services would be involved, repeating, "They'll blame me. I'll never get out of trouble." The next day, Ms. Reynolds, a social worker from Oakridge County, arrived at the school. She'd handled numerous cases of suspected abuse, but something about Jacob's haunted silence unnerved her. She found him in Mr. Bennett's classroom during lunch. Jacob sat at a table in the corner, nibbling a sandwich, eyes flicking up anxiously as Ms. Reynolds introduced herself. "Jacob, I'm here to make sure you're safe, all right? Can we talk somewhere private?" He followed her to an empty counseling room, shoulders hunched. She spoke softly, explaining she was there to help. "If something's wrong at home, I can protect you," she said, but he only trembled, voice shaking as he insisted everything was fine, that he was just clumsy and shy, that the bruises came from falling off his bike. She didn't believe it for a second, but without a direct statement or visible severe injuries, her hands were tied. Nevertheless, Ms. Reynolds had enough concerns to schedule a home visit. She told Ms. Hayes and Mr. Bennett she would drop by the Mitchell household unannounced. The teachers were relieved. They hoped an official presence would unravel the truth. However, when Ms. Reynolds visited that modest suburban home, she found Daniel and Karen Mitchell smiling politely, guiding her into a neat living room with tasteful decor. They offered her coffee and insisted they had no idea why Jacob was so fearful. "He's just quiet," Karen said sweetly, "and we're trying to draw him out of his shell." Daniel nodded, portraying himself as a strict but caring father figure. Ms. Reynolds examined their body language, noticing how Karen's eyes flicked to Daniel for confirmation whenever she spoke. Something felt off, but they wore their politeness like armor. Jacob stood in the corner, silent, refusing to say a word beyond nods. Ms. Reynolds left the house unsettled, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. The Mitchells had not overtly threatened him in her presence, but the dynamic radiated tension. Returning to her office, Ms. Reynolds documented her impressions. She found the Mitchells controlling, especially Daniel, who did most of the talking while Karen hovered protectively. Jacob's hush seemed fearful, but he denied being hurt, even though Ms. Reynolds suspected he was hiding bruises. Procedurally, she didn't have immediate cause to remove him from the home. She made plans to check back in a few weeks and reminded the teachers to keep watch for further signs. Yet that night, Ms. Reynolds couldn't sleep, haunted by the boy's terrified eyes. Over the next month, the bruises on Jacob's arms multiplied. Ms. Hayes confronted him when she caught a glimpse of fresh marks under his sleeve. "What happened, Jacob? Did something happen at home?" He stared at his shoes, mumbling an incoherent excuse. She pressed him gently. "We just want the truth." He shook his head, tears welling, repeating only that he was clumsy. She felt her heart break at the defeat in his posture. She reported to Ms. Reynolds again. The social worker returned to the Mitchells, but again they deflected, claiming he was prone to self-harm or imaginative stories. Ms. Reynolds, recognizing the pattern, insisted on a medical check. Daniel and Karen reluctantly agreed, but only after a week of stalling, claiming scheduling conflicts. By then, many bruises had faded. The doctor found minor contusions consistent with falls but no proof of assault. Ms. Reynolds realized the Mitchells were dressing Jacob in ways that hid his worst injuries and delaying any checkups long enough for bruises to heal. It enraged her, but she needed concrete evidence to act. The tipping point arrived unexpectedly. Mr. Sullivan once again found Jacob loitering after school, but this time the boy wore a cut near his temple, barely concealed by his hair. Startled, the janitor gently asked him what happened. Jacob burst into tears, trembling so violently that Mr. Sullivan guided him to the empty cafeteria. As Ms. Hayes came rushing over, the boy whispered, "They said if I told, they'd lock me in the basement. I can't do it anymore." Ms. Hayes, choking back her own horror, called Ms. Reynolds on the spot. This time, the social worker arrived in less than half an hour. She took one look at the fresh wound on Jacob's temple and marched him out of the school with a protective arm around his shoulders. She told Daniel Mitchell curtly over the phone that he and Karen were under investigation, and that Jacob would be placed in temporary care until the matter was resolved. For a brief moment, the teachers felt relief. But that relief splintered when they learned the Mitchells had retained a lawyer and were vigorously contesting the removal. Ms. Reynolds placed Jacob in a state-run shelter rather than a private foster home, unsure how best to protect him from any meddling. The teachers visited him, bringing books and small comforts. But the shelter environment overwhelmed Jacob. Surrounded by older, troubled kids, uncertain staff rotations, and the echo of too many heartbreaks, he withdrew further. After a week, panic set in. One night, he slipped out through a back entrance and vanished into the city streets. When Ms. Reynolds discovered he was missing, she alerted the police. An urgent search began, but no one could find him. Mr. Bennett, who had bonded with the boy during lunchtime chats, drove around all night, scanning alleys and parks. He pictured the boy, small and vulnerable, cowering in the dark. At dawn, exhausted and desperate, Mr. Bennett finally noticed a figure curled behind a dumpster near a diner. Pulling over, heart pounding, he recognized Jacob's dark hair peeking from under an oversized hoodie. "Jacob," Mr. Bennett called gently. The boy blinked awake, terror lighting up his face until he recognized the teacher. Then, with a shaky sob, he stumbled into Mr. Bennett's arms. I'm so sorry," Jacob mumbled. "I couldn't stay there. It's too scary. I don't want to be alone." Mr. Bennett coaxed him into the passenger seat, tears in his own eyes. "You're not alone," he promised, starting the car and switching on the heater. He called Ms. Reynolds, letting her know he found Jacob safe. After a brief discussion, Mr. Bennett made a bold choice. "Let me foster him," he said. "At least until we find a stable solution." Ms. Reynolds hesitated. He was just a teacher, not a trained foster parent. But time was short, and the boy needed immediate placement. She agreed to expedite an emergency certification if Mr. Bennett truly wanted it. The teacher replied with unwavering resolve. "He needs someone he trusts. I can't walk away from him." Thus began a new chapter for Jacob. He moved into Mr. Bennett's modest apartment, a small living room, a cramped kitchen, and a spare bedroom that had once been the teacher's study. Mr. Bennett cleared out the desk, set up a bed with fresh sheets, and brought in a few comforting items. The transition was awkward. Jacob had never seen a teacher in sweatpants or cooking dinner. But on that first evening, as they ate simple pasta together, Jacob let out a soft sigh. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry I'm such a burden." Mr. Bennett's heart clenched. He gently replied, "You're not a burden, Jacob. I want you to feel safe here." For a fleeting time, the boy relaxed, even smiled occasionally. He grew comfortable enough to do his homework at the kitchen table, while Mr. Bennett graded papers. Ms. Hayes and Ms. Reynolds visited, bringing warm meals or second-hand clothes in the correct size. Jacob's bruises slowly faded. But overshadowing this fragile calm were the ongoing legal proceedings. The Mitchells had filed a countersuit claiming the removal was unjust, labeling Jacob a liar who made up stories to gain attention. They claimed Ms. Reynolds had a personal vendetta, that the teachers were meddling do-gooders who misunderstood normal discipline. The case advanced to family court, with multiple hearings set to determine whether the Mitchells would regain custody. Jacob felt his stomach churn whenever the subject came up. "They'll win," he insisted to Ms. Hayes one afternoon after class. "They always do. I saw how they fooled people before." The teacher tried to reassure him, but her own heart felt uneasy. She knew how manipulative abusers could appear in a courtroom, especially if the child was too frightened to testify. And indeed, When Ms. Reynolds asked Jacob if he would speak before the judge, he turned pale, shaking his head vehemently. "No. I can't face them," he whispered, eyes brimming with tears. "They'll make me out to be a liar, or they'll come after me again." Ms. Reynolds gently explained that his testimony could be crucial, but he refused. At the first hearing, attorneys for the Mitchells spun a sorrowful tale of a child with behavioral issues, claiming Jacob's self-harm to gain sympathy. They produced photos from earlier years where the boy looked healthy and smiling. They insisted Ms. Reynolds had targeted them unfairly due to a personal bias. Jacob, sitting with Mr. Bennett in the back of the courtroom, listened to these lies, heart hammering. The Mitchells' lawyer pointedly asked where the proof of violence was, ignoring the boy's silent terror. Without direct testimony or photographic evidence of abuse in progress, the judge seemed uncertain. The case was extended for further review, but the Mitchells walked out wearing smug smiles. They even glared at Jacob across the hall, and he shrank behind Mr. Bennett, tears threatening. In the weeks that followed, tension mounted. Ms. Reynolds and the teachers tried to gather any evidence they could, medical records, statements from neighbors who might have heard screaming, anything that could validate Jacob's claims. But the Mitchells had hidden their tracks, carefully controlling appearances. The neighbors only recalled polite interactions, no visible fights. The Mitchells' acquaintances from church described them as upright citizens. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that the judge might be leaning in their favor, seeing no conclusive proof of abuse. Jacob overheard these discussions and spiraled into despair. "They'll take me back," he whispered to Mr. Bennett late one night, tears sliding down his cheeks. "And it'll be even worse because I told on them." The teacher struggled for comforting words but found none that felt convincing. Instead, he offered a tight hug, wishing he could shield the boy from the system's failings. At the second court hearing, the Mitchells arrived with new claims that Jacob had vandalized their home. They produced doctored photographs of broken items, blaming him. They insisted that his bruises likely came from fights at school, referencing the fact that no teacher witnessed the Fosters hitting him. Jacob, sitting stiffly next to Ms. Reynolds, felt shame and dread stirring. The judge looked unconvinced by the vandalism story, but still demanded more evidence of abuse. Ms. Reynolds, exhausted, attempted to bring up Jacob's repeated pleas at school, the times he begged not to go home. Yet none of these stories matched the clarity of an actual child testifying. On the sidelines, Daniel and Karen Mitchell observed, calm smiles on their faces, acting like devoted parents wrongly accused. As the hearing ended for the day, the judge indicated that if no solid proof emerged soon, he might rule in the Fosters' favor. Jacob's heart sank. Ms. Reynolds' face tightened in frustration. That night, Mr. Bennett found Jacob curled up in the corner of the living room, hugging a cushion. "They're going to put me back there," the boy choked out. "And everything will be worse." The teacher knelt beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "We won't let that happen. You have me, Ms. Hayes, Mr. Sullivan, everyone who cares about you. We'll keep fighting." But the boy only wept. "No one can help if the court believes them," he sobbed. "I'm just a stupid kid." Mr. Bennett felt tears of anger welling, outraged at the system that forced an 11-year-old into such despair. As the final hearing approached, Ms. Reynolds told Jacob in a gentle but urgent voice, "We really need you to speak up, Jacob. The judge needs to hear from you directly. If you stay silent, they might think we're all exaggerating. But if you tell them the truth, in your own words, they'll see." The boy trembled at the thought, nightmares of the Mitchells looming behind every memory. But something inside him stirred, a small flame of defiance. Mr. Bennett quietly added, "I'll be right there. You won't be alone." Jacob glanced at him, eyes glistening. "What if they laugh at me, or say I'm lying?" he asked in a broken whisper. The teacher's voice was resolute. "Tell your truth, Jacob. I promise I'll never let them hurt you again." The day of the hearing arrived. The tension crackled in the courthouse halls. Ms. Hayes and Mr. Sullivan came as moral support, sitting behind Ms. Reynolds. The Mitchells lounged in the front row with their lawyer, arms folded, exuding calm confidence. The judge entered, and the hearing resumed. With the Mitchells' attorney restating their position that Jacob was a troubled child, Ms. Reynolds stood, announcing that the boy himself wished to speak. A murmur spread through the audience. The Mitchells exchanged sharp glances. Jacob, heart pounding, approached the witness stand, so small behind the microphone. He glanced at Mr. Bennet, who nodded encouragingly from the gallery. For a moment, Jacob couldn't speak. His gaze flicked to the Mitchells, who stared coldly back. The judge prompted him gently. Tears slid down his face. Then, with a shaky inhale, he began. "They hurt me." The words stammered out, quiet but resolute. The attorney for the Mitchells started to object, but the judge silenced them. Jacob continued in broken fragments, describing nights locked in a dark closet, the harsh slaps when he did something they didn't like, the fear that kept him silent at school. As he spoke, his voice gained a tremor of fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Daniel and Karen. "They dressed me in long sleeves so no one would see the bruises. They threatened me if I told. They said the system doesn't care about kids anyway." A hush fell in the room. Ms. Reynolds wiped tears from her eyes, Mr. Bennet clenched his hands in his lap, and Ms. Hayes stared at the floor. The Mitchells fidgeted, confusion and anger rippling across their faces. Jacob sobbed as he poured out the horror of his daily life, the insults, the beatings, the forced lies whenever teachers asked. The judge listened intently, letting the boy speak uninterrupted. When Jacob finally paused, exhausted, the judge turned to the Mitchells. Their lawyer faltered, trying to question Jacob's credibility, but the raw emotion in his testimony cut through every argument. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, and each time, Jacob's answers were consistent, painfully honest. In that moment, the tide turned. The Mitchells' facade cracked under the weight of the boy's truth. The judge declared that the Fosters had likely inflicted serious harm, referencing new consistency in the timeline and the boy's unguarded statements. The attorney tried to salvage the case, but it was futile. The judge ordered an immediate guilty verdict in the abuse hearing, revoking the Mitchells' rights to foster or adopt. They faced criminal charges for child endangerment and assault. Jacob stepped down from the stand in tears of both anguish and relief. Ms. Reynolds embraced him gently as the Mitchells were taken away by security, snarling in outrage. In the aftermath, Jacob was placed in the temporary care of Mr. Bennet, who had proven to be a safe guardian. The boy remained deeply shaken, especially by the final glare from Daniel Mitchell as the officers escorted him out. Ms. Reynolds warned Mr. Bennet that abusers sometimes lash out even after losing in court. Mr. Bennet tried to reassure Jacob with locks on the doors, and a talk with local police to keep watch. For a few days, the tension eased as they believed the Mitchells wouldn't risk further crimes. Jacob started therapy sessions more consistently, trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered trust. Ms. Hayes visited with fresh baked muffins. Mr. Sullivan stopped by with a gift of new sneakers. Everyone tried to show that the boy was finally free from fear. But 2.5 weeks later, in the dead of a cool autumn night, the unthinkable happened. The Mitchells, apparently out on bail pending additional charges, decided to take matters into their own hands. They broke into Mr. Bennet's small apartment at around 3 a.m, jamming the lock and creeping silently through the living room. Mr. Bennet awoke to the sound of creaking floorboards. Before he could react, a strong arm pinned him down, Daniel's voice hissing with rage. "We're taking him back. We'll show him what lying does." Karen loomed in the darkness, brandishing a small pistol. Jacob, awakened by the commotion, scrambled out of his bed, heart pounding so loudly he could hardly hear. In the hallway, he found Daniel's glowering face. Fear paralyzed him. Karen smirked, flipping on a flashlight to reveal her expression twisted with hatred. "Thought you'd get rid of us?" she sneered. "We're finishing this." Mr. Bennet tried to intervene, but Daniel shoved him against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. Karen forced Jacob to gather a few clothes in a bag. "Don't fight," Daniel hissed, "or your beloved teacher pays." Jacob's eyes filled with terror. He glanced at Mr. Bennet, lying winded on the floor, blood trickling from his lip. Jacob's mind screamed with panic, but he complied, shaking uncontrollably as Karen tightened her grip on the pistol. They rushed him outside to a waiting car with stolen plates, tossing him in the back seat. A muffled yell from Mr. Bennett echoed as they sped away, disappearing into the night. For Jacob, the next 4 days were a living nightmare. The Mitchells drove across state lines, stopping only for gas at isolated stations where Daniel kept a tight hold on the boy, Karen always watchful with the pistol under her coat. They found a rundown cabin in a wooded area, hidden from prying eyes. There they locked Jacob in a small room, forcing him to eat scraps and endure their furious rants about how he ruined them with his testimony. "You're ours," Karen snarled more than once, face contorted with hatred. "We gave you a home, and you turned on us." Daniel threatened him with worse fates if he tried to run, implying they might kill him this time. Jacob wept silently at night, curled up on a filthy cot, longing for the safety of Mr. Bennett's apartment, the kindness of Miss Hayes, the stable presence of Ms. Reynolds. Back in Oakridge, chaos erupted when Mr. Bennett reported the kidnapping to local police. Ms. Reynolds, Ms. Hayes, and Mr. Sullivan rallied, calling in every favor they could. The FBI joined the search upon learning it was a case of abduction across state lines. Mr. Bennett, though shaken, provided every detail he could about the Mitchells, their possible hideouts, their old acquaintances. Ms. Reynolds contacted every county official in neighboring states. Anxiety soared as hours turned to days with no sign of Jacob. The teachers felt sick with worry. Each night, Ms. Hayes prayed silently, picturing the boy's haunted eyes. Mr. Sullivan combed through the local outskirts, hoping for any clue. The sense of helplessness was almost unbearable. At the cabin, the Mitchells' anger only grew. On the 3rd day, Daniel ranted about escaping to another country, forging new identities. Karen paced, paranoid about the FBI. Jacob cowered, unsure if they meant to kill him or keep him as a bargaining chip. By the morning of the 4th day, tensions reached a boiling point. Daniel demanded that Karen pack the car. He insisted they move again to evade detection. Karen, exhausted, demanded they just deal with the boy once and for all. Jacob felt numb, certain his death loomed. Then, as they argued fiercely, the faint rumble of engines approached outside, accompanied by the distinct crackle of loudspeakers. The FBI had found them. A voice outside boomed. "This is the FBI. We have the cabin surrounded. Come out with your hands up." The Mitchells erupted in panic, Karen grabbing her pistol, Daniel cursing. The agents repeated the command. A standoff ensued. Karen yanked Jacob into the main room, pressing the gun to his temple, screaming threats at the windows. Daniel joined her, brandishing a makeshift club. The cabin door rattled as agents tried to negotiate. Tension choked the air. For Jacob, time slowed to a horrifying crawl. He heard the frantic shouts from outside, glimpsed shadows through the boarded windows. Karen's hand shook around the weapon. Daniel clenched his jaw, sweat beading on his brow. Then, the agents made a daring move, smashing in a back window with a flash bang. The resulting explosion of noise and light disoriented the Mitchells. Daniel swung blindly, bellowing curses. Karen fired a wild shot that pinged off the old wood stove. The front door splintered as an agent burst in, tackling Karen's arm. She screamed, the gun twisting sideways. Another agent rushed Daniel. He tried to bring the club down on the agent, but a swift blow knocked him out cold. Meanwhile, the first agent forced Karen's gun away, and in the scuffle, she took a bullet to the leg, crying out. Within seconds, the cabin was swarming with federal officers, securing the scene. Dazed, Jacob stumbled free, collapsing into the arms of a female agent who held him, whispering, "You're safe." Amid the swirl of commands and paramedics, Daniel lay unconscious on the floor, wrists zip-tied, and Karen clutched her bleeding leg, wailing curses. The agents wasted no time. Both Fosters were taken into custody, read their rights, and dragged to waiting vehicles. Jacob's chest heaved with sobs he couldn't control. He'd been so certain he'd die in that cabin. The agents led him gently outside, where an ambulance sat with lights flashing, ready to check his condition. Outside the perimeter, Ms. Reynolds and a few local officers waited, relief washing over them upon seeing him alive. The call was made back to Oakridge. Jacob was rescued. It took a day's worth of medical checks and statements at a local hospital before Jacob could finally return to Oakridge with Ms. Reynolds. The teachers, Mr. Sullivan, and especially Mr. Bennett awaited him at the station with tears of joy. He looked battered and exhausted, but he was alive. Under heavy sedation and the nurse's care, he managed a frail hug from Mr. Bennett. "They can't hurt you anymore," Mr. Bennett whispered, stroking the boy's hair. "They're gone. They're locked up." Jacob let out a sob of relief, too weary for words. The next weeks were a blur of therapy sessions, legal confirmations that the Mitchells were imprisoned for kidnapping, child abuse, and multiple other charges. Their bail was revoked, ensuring no immediate threat to Jacob. Local news outlets covered the story with fervor. "Kidnapped foster child found in dramatic FBI rescue." Strangers sent letters of support to Oakridge Middle School. The boy, while touched, felt overwhelmed. He dreaded returning to school with so many eyes on him. But Ms. Hayes and Mr. Sullivan found ways to gently transition him back, ensuring he wasn't the center of gossip. Another teacher offered a private tutoring arrangement until he felt comfortable in class again. In the end, the final 25% of the story focused on Jacob's slow, painstaking journey toward emotional recovery. Mr. Bennett, who had grown fiercely protective of the boy, formally applied to adopt him. Ms. Reynolds wholeheartedly supported the idea, having witnessed their bond. The court process for adoption was simpler now that the Mitchells had forfeited any parental claim through their crimes. Jacob, though still haunted by nightmares, found solace in the knowledge that he'd never be forced into another foster arrangement. He'd have a permanent home with a man who showed unwavering kindness from day one. It took 2 months of paperwork and evaluations, but on a chilly morning in early winter, the adoption was approved. The judge, thankfully one who had not been duped by the Mitchells, smiled warmly at the small ceremony, congratulating them. "This is a new beginning," she said. Jacob nodded shyly, tears glistening in his eyes. Mr. Bennett placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze, voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home, son." Those final days saw Jacob adjusting to a calmer routine. He shared dinner with Mr. Bennett each night, sometimes joined by Ms. Hayes or Ms. Reynolds. They told stories of the journey that brought them here, occasionally sad but mostly hopeful. Jacob slowly regained confidence, even writing about his experiences in a personal journal that Ms. Hayes had given him. The nightmares persisted but lessened in intensity. Therapists assured him that healing takes time, that he'd carry scars but could still flourish with love and support. The story ended exactly 2 months after the kidnapping, on an evening when Jacob and Mr. Bennett sat down for dinner. The table held a simple meal: baked chicken, steamed vegetables, a pitcher of water. Outside, dusk settled over Oakridge, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Jacob set out 2 plates, and Mr. Bennett brought the food. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, until Mr. Bennett asked, "How are you feeling, truly?" Jacob paused, considered. "Safe," he answered softly. "I'm just safe." They exchanged smiles, the weight of that single word speaking volumes. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.